Hi, everyone. My name is Logan Bayroff, Director of Communications at J Street, with you once again in this session. Earlier in today's session, we've heard some of our political leaders speak a bit about the dangers that are posed by white nationalism and anti-Semitism and how they threaten American Jews and other vulnerable minorities in our country. Now we want to dig further into the nature of that threat and how we fight it, and talk with a group of expert activists and commentators about how we can best understand and confront anti-Semitism and bigotry while avoiding paths that lead to harmful divisions or false equivalencies in our work. Our speakers for this discussion, our esteemed panelists, are Amy Spitalnik, Executive Director of Integrity First for America. Salam Al-Marayati is President of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and Peter Beinart is a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times and editor-at-large at Jewish Currents. Thank you all so much for being here with J Street today.
Thank you. My honor.
I wanted to just start with, over the past few years, we've seen this proliferation of white supremacist anti-Semitic attacks, and those have included horrifying attacks on Jews, on Muslims, on communities of color. What do you see as some of the main factors driving this trend? And what are the linkages that we've seen between the attacks on the Jewish community and attacks that we are seeing directed at other communities? Amy, I thought we'd start with you on this question.
Absolutely. It's so important to understand that none of these attacks are happening in a vacuum. They aren't isolated incidents, but rather they're part of a cycle of extremism in which each attack is used to inspire the next one. And there are a few core factors at play here. I think first and foremost, it's important to understand the ideology. Many of us know viscerally how we felt when we saw neo-Nazis chanting, "Jews will not replace us," marching on Charlottesville. Or we witnessed the Pittsburgh massacre, which specifically chose the Tree of Life congregation because of its work with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And at the core of so many of these both obvious white supremacist attacks like Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, and on, but also some of these sort of more subtle attacks, if you will, is this idea of something being stolen from white people or the white race being, quote unquote, replaced. And this isn't an accident, but rather it's a conspiracy theory that's at the core of white supremacy and white nationalism, this idea of the great replacement, which argues that Jews are the puppet masters who are orchestrating the replacement of the white race through its support of Black and brown people, refugees, immigrants, and a whole host of other communities, none of which fit into the white supremacists' vile and narrow vision for what they want this country to be. And so in some ways it manifests obviously. Jews will not replace us, or the Tree of Life attack, so many other white supremacist attacks that have explicitly referenced this great replacement. We also see it manifest in more subtle ways, this idea that George Soros is funding the Black Lives Matter protests, or he's supporting a caravan coming up from Central America, or even in the Capitol attack, which of course was a violent extremist attack. But when they reference stopping the steal, it alludes to this idea of the country being stolen. And you can hear those same conspiracies and undertones in that sort of violence and attack. And what this does is it illustrates how deeply intertwined our community's fates are here. Anti-Semitism is at the core of white nationalism and white supremacy. It is one of the greatest motivators, this idea that Jews are orchestrating all the other ills that these white supremacists deem impermissible and unwanted in our society. So you can't take on anti-Semitism without taking on white supremacy and racism and Islamophobia and xenophobia and all these other forms of hate. But likewise, you can't take on those forms of hate without taking on anti-Semitism. And of course, the second thing I will say is that the tactics that we see here are also clear across the board, and specifically the use of social media to plan and elevate these attacks. In so many ways, social media has become the Klandon of the 21st century, and we see this directly in the connections between the attacks. We know, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders before killing 11 at Tree of Life. The Christchurch shooter donated to two prominent American white supremacists who are defendants in my organization's Charlottesville lawsuit, and then painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was popularized by a third. And the Christchurch attack was live streamed on social media on Facebook, and in turn inspired the Poway and El Paso attacks. And even now, as we see the news coming out with these new indictments and charges brought against the Capitol insurrectionists, the ways in which the Capitol attacks so closely followed the Charlottesville playbook and other prior playbooks, specifically as it relates to the use of social media to plan these attacks, is so crucial. And so it's important that we understand not only that these attacks are connected in the ideology that they share, but also in the tactics in which each attack is used to inspire the next. And this playbook is something that we should know and understand at this point. And no one should be surprised by attacks like January 6th, because we've seen this playbook before.
I think that it's, I mean, I agree with everything that Amy said. And I think that what's really significant is, it seems to me, the interlocking ways in which stereotypes of Jews interact with stereotypes of Black and brown people. So that because white nationalists are racists, who often don't think that Black and brown people have agency and can organize themselves, they look for a kind of a hidden hand. And because the stereotype of Jews is different, right, that it's of the sinister genius, then Jews are brought in order to explain how it is that these people who racists consider inferior are actually organizing movements of change. And this is not new, right? Why were there so many segregationists who said that Jewish communists were behind the civil rights movement? Because they were racist and couldn't recognize that Black people had created a movement themselves. I'm the child of South Africans. I remember very clearly that the white South African government was always claiming that Joe Slovo, the head of the South African Communist Party, a Lithuanian-born Jew, was running the ANC. He wasn't running the ANC. It's just that they thought it took a white Jewish person to actually run this movement. And that's why I think people can make these crazy leaps from a kind of fear, a paranoia about a migrant caravan coming from Central America, to then end up shooting up a synagogue in Pittsburgh because it has it's been connected to a pro-immigrant Jewish organization. And it just shows, again, just to build on what Amy's saying, the ways in which these struggles are fundamentally interrelated, that either we move together towards a country that provides equality under the law for everybody, or if the people who want this to be an ethno-nationalist nation with a narrow, bigoted definition of Americanism, we're all in danger.
These are excellent points that both Peter and Amy made, and I can't agree with it anymore. And they were said so eloquently. I'll just substantiate the points because I served on the Department of Homeland Security Advisory Council that looked at protecting houses of worship against these threats. And in our site visit to Poway, for example, exactly what was said, that the culprit had invoked what happened in New Zealand in Christchurch as the motivation for killing Jewish congregants at that time and shooting at the Chabad house there. And it was linked to the firebombing of the mosque just 10 miles south of the Jewish Center in Escondido by the same person. So that right there is the illustration, unfortunately, of how we are intertwined, we're interconnected with this threat. It also shows us that this is a transnational threat. So when they say that this is domestic terrorism, I think that's a misnomer. This is as transnational as it can get, whether it's connected to New Zealand or what happened in Norway with the terrorist attack there. They are all interconnected and part of a conspiracy theory that Jews and Muslims are out to defeat the West, to defeat America. And in terms of the Pittsburgh shooting, the conspiracy theory that was that Jews were financing the caravan to bring Muslims from south of the border into America to kill Christians. And unfortunately, this has mainstream audiences. When Franklin Graham, for example, says that Islam is an evil religion, that is part of the inspiration, unfortunately, that we're dealing with this problem. It is a religious, ethno-nationalistic threat against the United States, against all of us, as Peter said.
I think as you spoke about the ways in which the attacks on these different communities and our different communities are very much connected, I think it made me think of the ways in which we've also seen some forces on the right really trying to divide our communities and stop people maybe from recognizing those those similarities by trying to emphasize differences. Something we've seen is that as fears about rising anti-Semitism have grown, we've also seen very cynical partisan attempts to try to equate the threat of far-right violence threatening Jewish people with that, supposedly posed perhaps by leftist critics of Israel or critics of Zionism, like folks in the BDS movement. And this has become something that has been, I think, forced a little bit into the political and media narrative around the question of how we fight anti-Semitism today. So why do you think we hear this false equivalency from some voices in our politics or in the Jewish community? And how have you seen it potentially drive a wedge between communities that should be standing together based on what you all are saying against a common threat? Salam, I thought perhaps you might want to take this first.
Sure. Number one, I think we all have to see that this is a common threat against both Jews and Muslims in particular. And they use anti-Muslim rhetoric because that's what they feel they can get away with. It's easy to spout anti-Muslim animus here in our culture, unfortunately. It's still tolerated. And I think that's the first thing that we have to recognize. Number two, we're not being threatened by members from the left. People from the left are not killing members of our community. They're not firebombing our mosques. They're not shooting at our synagogues and Jewish centers. It's coming from the right, and that has to be that has to be underscored. Number three, in terms of BDS, I believe there needs to be more conversation about what we, as Muslims, as people who support the cause for a Palestinian state someday to happen, we believe that this is a nonviolent form of resistance. That in order to pressure the Israeli government to stop the occupation of the West Bank and the siege of Gaza, that we need to use nonviolent resistance. And we all thought that we should do away with violent resistance and work on nonviolent resistance because that's what we were told this whole time. And now to do that and then to be attacked as being anti-Semitic, I think that we need to have a conversation about that so that even if groups are against BDS from the Jewish community, they can understand where we are coming from. And we don't have to treat each other as enemies, but people that can have disagreements on issues. There's disagreements on so many policy issues, and I think J Street and the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC, are exemplifying that partnership, that we will disagree on that issue, but we will not attack each other for that issue. And then when it comes to BDS, we've had problems, obviously, from several groups that try to criminalize our speech, that are trying to punish people for supporting BDS, especially students on campuses. There is that false equivalence, as you put it, Logan, that somehow because we are critics of the policy of the state of Israel, that we're put into this anti-Semitic camp. And we are just as bad as these right-wing extremists that are actually doing the killing, doing the shooting, and threatening our communities. And I think we need to have more conversations about that false equivalence.
Peter, you've written and spoken so much on this subject. I thought you might want to chime in.
Sure. So I would start by saying, look, it's not that there isn't anti-Semitism on the left. Anti-Semitism is a highly kind of malleable, creative kind of sickness, and it shows up in all kinds of different places. There was plenty of state-sponsored anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, for instance. I think Louis Farrakhan has said many anti-Semitic things, and he's on the left, at least in the sense that he's a lot more connected to Democratic politicians than he is to Republican politicians. But I think the fundamental question is really not left versus right. It's whether your critique of anti-Semitism is embedded in a larger struggle for the human rights and equality of all people. If it is, then you also have to be concerned about Palestinian rights. And the problem with so much of the discourse about criticizing left-wing anti-Semitism is not that there's no left-wing anti-Semitism. It is that it is an effort to break away the discourse from anti-Semitism from the discourse of human rights, from the discourse of the equality, the rights of all people, right? And perversely, to use anti-Semitism as a cudgel against people who are struggling for Palestinian human rights. Now, we may not always agree on the best way to do that. I'm not a supporter of the BDS movement, for instance, but any invocation of anti-Semitism, which is being used to defend the degradation of people's human dignity, right, to shield the Israeli government from accountability for its control over millions of Palestinians who have fewer rights than a black person in the Jim Crow South, because not only can they not vote in practice, they're not even citizens of the country in which they live. This seems to me fundamentally a kind of perverse and beyond not just only perverse, but a kind of a desecration of what the struggle for against anti-Semitism should be. Because as we've been seeing before, not just for moral reasons, but for reasons of self-protection, the struggle for anti-Semitism can't ultimately succeed unless it's embedded in a broader struggle, universal struggle for human rights. So just to mention someone in particular, when I see Josh Mandel running for the Senate in Ohio, saying that he's running to support Judeo-Christian values, whatever the heck that is, and not radical Muslim values, I think the man is not only a bigot, but he's a fool, because this is not ultimately thinking that Jews are going to be safe and that the struggle against anti-Semitism is be successful when you link it to when you turn it into a form of bigotry yourself against another group. It seems to me our history shows that that's very foolish.
And to build on some of that, I think it's so important to note that a specific white supremacist tactic is to try to pit communities against one another in precisely this way. Because we know that, as we've been saying here, you can't take on anti-Semitism without taking on these other forms of hate, and vice versa. The struggle, as Peter said, the struggle for against anti-Semitism is so deeply embedded in so many other struggles for human rights, dignity, and equality. And so white supremacists understand that by pitting communities against one another, dividing them, they can undermine the fight against that white supremacy. And so you see very specific ways in which these white supremacists try to pit communities against one another, because they know when we are not united in the struggle against white supremacy, it makes their job that much easier. And to that point, it's precisely why we see the right trying to use the cudgel of anti-Semitism to divide communities. This idea that we as the Jewish community can't be partnering with the Black community because of potential anti-Semitism in the Black community. We can't be partnering with the Muslim community because of support for BDS and this idea that that is somehow anti-Semitic in all of its forms. And so while it has been said here, I think it's worth saying one more time, there of course can be anti-Semitism on the left and in a variety of different ways, and anti-Israel activity can even morph into anti-Semitism in certain ways. But that doesn't mean that there is any potential or possible equivalency between far-right extremist violence that is literally killing Jews in synagogue and so much other horror that we've seen over the last few years, and left-wing extremism. There is no equivalency there in any way, shape, or form, and it's so important that we make that clear.
I just wanted to add to that as well that when I listen to Amy and Peter, it's a mirror of what we are talking about in the Muslim community. We're saying exactly the same thing as it relates to Muslims, that we cannot be devoted to working against anti-Muslim animus if we do not base it on what Islam actually contributed to world civilization, and that is to bring human dignity. That is in the Quran. It's founded, that it says in the Quran that God had made it so that he established human dignity among the children of Adam. And so if it's just about our discrimination against us and rhetoric against us, then it's that sense of victimhood that deteriorates the importance and the relevance and the value of what our religion is actually telling us what we should be working for. Our prophets did not say that we are going to be working against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. They all worked for human dignity. They all worked for a better tomorrow. They all worked for the disenfranchised and the dispossessed. That is what makes our religions great religions. And if we lose sight of that for the sake of attacking those who we feel are our enemies, then I think we lose that moral foundation of our work. The last thing I want to say is this notion that there's something called Judeo-Christian. There was never anything called Judeo-Christian other than something that excluded Muslims. If we're talking about the Abrahamic faiths, we're all followers of Abraham. So to start dividing religion like that, it again is a form of political exploitation and a form of religious nationalism that is far from what our great religions espouse to begin with.
Obviously, we had 4 years in this country with a president who not only did nothing really to stop these trends, but I think we'd all agree in many ways actively encouraged them, and many in his party actively stoked them in some ways for his own political benefit or what he perceived that way. Now that we have an administration that campaigned in part on these issues and the pain of what we saw in Charlottesville and the need to push back on this type of hatred and obviously takes it far more seriously. If you were to speak, and I'm sure some of you do, with leaders of the Biden administration or leaders in Congress who are looking to, determine how do we fight rising anti-Semitism and how do we fight rising white nationalism, white supremacism, what are sort of the main, top-line recommendations that you would make to them, both about how to go about succeeding in that effort and avoiding falling into some of the pitfalls that we've also discussed in this conversation today?
I think the last 4 years have put a fine point on both the fact that, yes, we have allowed this extremism to fester and to grow while the president of the United States not just encouraged it, but actively threw fuel on the fire in very explicit and deliberate ways. And it's not a surprise and it's not an accident that Charlottesville and the Capitol attack bookended the Trump presidency. They followed the same playbook in so many ways as I described earlier, but they also were sort of perfect bookends, sad bookends, to the ways in which extremism has grown and thrived over the last 4 years. And one of the horrifying details that's coming out now is that compared to Charlottesville, where so many people were, not all, but in many cases affiliated with white supremacist and white nationalist groups, at the Capitol, there were so many people who were not necessarily affiliated with those sorts of groups or even had participated in any sort of extremist activity until that attack. And what that tells us is that extremism has been mainstreamed over the last 4 years. We also see this, of course, with members of Congress like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others who have not only embraced extremism in ways, but actively traffic in the same sorts of white supremacist conspiracy theories that we have been talking about here. And so understanding the mainstreaming of extremism over the last 4 years is so important to breaking the cycle. But I think there's a few things that the Biden administration can do and has even started to do. One, accountability matters. There has been so little accountability over the last few years. My organization brought a lawsuit against the leaders of the Charlottesville violence, and we're going to trial this fall. But it really is the only legal effort going after the broad leadership of this movement right now. Which is sad. In a different time, in a different era, Charlottesville might not have happened, but if it had, there likely would have been Department of Justice cases brought against those responsible. And the fact that we as a private entity are really the only game in town there is a sad testament to the stunning lack of accountability over the last few years. The accountability matters, both when it comes to these larger scale events and the Department of Justice's ability to act there, and of course ensuring state, local, and other actors are prosecuting and enforcing hate crimes laws. So that's one piece of the puzzle. Of course, we've talked here as well about the role of social media. You can't understand extremism in America and the ways in which it's been allowed to proliferate and grow without understanding the way in which social media has been perhaps the biggest factor there. In the past, Klansmen could meet in the woods in their white hoods, and their activities would be fairly relegated to the geographic area where they lived. But now they're able to connect not just nationally, but globally. And as I think Salam said earlier, this is a transnational threat, and we see the ways in which extremists are able to use social media to inspire one another, encourage action. And until social media companies either accept their moral and ethical responsibilities to do something here, or there is regulatory action to force them to do so, we're not going to see a change. And so it's crucial to understand the role of social media companies. We have the tools. This idea that we need all these new statutes, all these new laws on the book to begin to take on this crisis is just false. We have the tools, they just haven't been used. And we have an opportunity right now, and we're starting to see the Biden administration do just that, to use the tools we have to finally take action and have some accountability when it comes to violent extremism.
Yes, and adding to Amy's excellent points, we need to remove investigative hurdles to hate crimes. Law enforcement is reticent on that issue, and many state and even municipal governments don't want to have that record that they have a hate crimes problem. So we need to keep advocating that these crimes need to be investigated as hate crimes. For example, in Chapel Hill, 3 Muslims were brutally murdered, execution style, by a person. And that person, when he was interviewed, he said, "Oh, this was over a parking dispute." And that was accepted by law enforcement, and it was not initially investigated as a hate crime. Of course it was a hate crime. And as they investigated it further, they had seen that the culprit had anti-Muslim animus as a driver. A crime is a crime. Terrorism is terrorism. It doesn't matter who commits it. We should not use religious labeling. We should not inflame the situation. But there should be one yardstick in terms of our legal instruments in dealing with these problems. The second thing is that bullies like to fight you in dark alleys when you're alone. We need to bring light to this problem. So when they go into their dark channels and spout anti-Semitic rhetoric, anti-Muslim, anti-Black, racism, xenophobia, we need to expose it. We need to bring it to the light of day. And like cowards, they will run away. Most of them will.
I would say, the words that I would love to hear Joe Biden speak would be anti-Palestinian bigotry. I think it's really significant that there really is no category in a mainstream American political discourse today called anti-Palestinian bigotry. And if that were even to exist as a thing that people imagined, it would be kind of revolutionary, right? Because virtually the entire Republican Party and frankly, large sections of the Democratic Party are entirely comfortable with Palestinians lacking basic human rights, right? Living under a different law in the West Bank and their Jewish neighbors, which is prima facie bigotry. I think that the reason it's so important to open a conversation about Palestinian bigotry is not only because of Palestinian rights, but also because it then raises the question of who we should trust to write our definitions of anti-Semitism. I don't trust people who are anti-Palestinian bigots or who are comfortable with anti-Palestinian bigotry to be the people defining what anti-Semitism is. The second point I want to raise is that I think because we've been talking about the interconnectedness of all these struggles, that sadly, I fear that we are heading into an era of escalating anti-Asian and anti-Chinese violence and bigotry. The history of the United States is that when the United States enters geopolitical conflicts with foreign countries, people look for enemies within. And I think that we are starting to see that in very, very disturbing ways. And I think it's very important. Of course, one can have very serious problems with the Chinese government. Of course, one must challenge the Chinese government on its human rights abuses, especially in Xinjiang with the genocide of Uyghurs. But when you create a hysterical, paranoid fear that the Chinese government is going to take over and destroy the United States, you create a kind of a McCarthyite climate, similar that existed in the 1950s in the United States, and very bad things happen. This, it seems to me, is part of the common struggle that we who care about anti-Muslim bigotry, who care about anti-Palestinian bigotry, who of course care about anti-Semitism need to be involved in.
The discourse that we saw in the aftermath of the Atlanta shootings, in which Asian American women were targeted, reflects precisely this point that both the Asian community is under increasing attack. We know there were over 3,800 incidents of anti-Asian violence in this country over the last year. And it's not an accident since the pandemic started and we had a president who was actively throwing fuel on the fire with a Chinese virus or Wuhan flu and all these other direct calls to extremism. It's not an accident that we saw that. And then when you have law enforcement suggesting that this was a guy with a quote unquote sexual addiction and it wasn't racially motivated, taking the alleged murderer's words at face value, that he wasn't doing this for racist reasons, but was simply suffering a sexual addiction, one, it ignores the ways in which misogyny and racism are inherently intertwined. And that's something that we haven't talked much about here, but is a central part of the interconnectedness of extremism. And two, it is intended to do exactly what Salam described earlier, which is to discount the hate that is at the core of so much violence in this country and has fueled a much larger rise in hate crimes and white supremacy and in extremism. And so it's important that we not fall prey to that trap and that we recognize, again, how deeply interconnected our fates are here, and that hate crimes are prosecuted as such, and that extremism is treated as such, no matter the form it takes. And we, for example, as Jews, I feel, have an obligation to make our voices crystal clear on this front when any community is under attack, both because we know what it's like to be under attack, and because, again, those hatreds are so deeply intertwined.
Thank you, and thanks to all of our panelists for a really important, honest, passionate conversation on a painful, complex, but really critical subject. So thank you to all of you, and I'm now going to turn it back to my colleague in the J Street studio to let us know what's coming next in our session.